here for coming. What we're going to do is what we do every month. We're going to talk about the collective astrological cycles for the month ahead. And this is the cosmic weather. It's not about your unique chart, your unique life. It describes the collective experiences that we all have to varying degrees. After Rick and I do our main presentation, we'll take a short break, and then we will look at 3 individual charts. If you would like us to look at your chart, to do just a little 4 or 5 minute mini reading, put your first name, your time, your date, and place of birth on a piece of paper, drop it up here somewhere, and we'll do a drawing during the break. So it's July, and you're not getting your money's worth tonight since we're already on the 8th of July.
I heard that Soulfood was giving everybody a 30% rebate on their entry fee tonight. Because the month is nearly a third over.
Right, but it's kind of interesting that this morning was the new moon. So even though it's the 8th of July, this does begin a new monthly cycle.
Right, and this new moon is really an interesting new moon for a lot of reasons. Actually, this whole month is, as I looked at the month, it's a special month. And in some ways, last month when I was here without Jeff, I talked a bit about this magical grand trine pattern that began last month, and that will become at least part of our theme for this evening, I'm sure.
Yeah, and that theme is really a watery theme. We begin the month for the first 3 weeks with the sun and the water sign of Cancer. And water signs, Cancer, Scorpio, and Pisces, are signs of feeling, signs of emotion that have little to do with logic in the ordinary sense, nor rationality, nor objectivity.
Or action, for that matter.
Well, that's your version of Cancer. Mine's a little more active than yours, I think. But there is that idea that the great gifts of this month will probably come in the quiet moments.
Well, let's put it this way. The action of water is often, or is best defined by its container or its relative position to gravity. So that water, basically, it can be active. It certainly can be active if anyone's ever whitewater canoed or stood under a waterfall. Water can be very active, but its action is defined by its response to the environment.
Mm. And I think that's where the information is for us this month, in our ability to listen and to respond on the inside. This store has lots of books in it. There's books all over the place. There's lots of written material online. There are lecturers standing up in front of you talking, all of which are sources of information. But the information that's most valuable this month is the kind that doesn't come in the form of words. It comes in feelings. It comes in music. It comes in touch. It comes through the other senses. So I think, and there are other reasons that Rick and I will talk about for this, but probably the best way to learn and to learn the most valuable lessons this month is simply to be quiet and listen. Now, this is reinforced in another way because Mercury, which is the talky, chatty communication planet, is going backwards right now.
And also in that same water sign of Cancer where the new moon was this morning. Yeah, if you look at where the planets are now, and for those of you who are not well versed in astrology, this wheel simply has the location of all the planets relative to the signs and relative to each other. And so we have Jupiter at 2 degrees just early in Cancer, and the sun and the moon, because it was a new moon today, are at the same degree in Cancer. And Mercury, as Jeff said, retrograde, we'll come back to that in a moment, is also in Cancer. In fact, in a few days, Mars will be in Cancer too. And we have Saturn, a slower moving planet that spends a couple of years or so in each sign. It's in Scorpio, another water sign, also feeling. And we have Neptune, and for those of you who care, Chiron, which is kind of an almost planet. But Neptune, which spends 14 years in a sign, in Pisces, also a water sign. And so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, soon to be 7 planets in water signs now, and that really is the backbone of what you were saying of all this kind of feeling nonverbal energy. And when we look for verbal analysis, we look at Mercury. Mercury in Cancer doesn't say much anyhow because it's in that receptive feeling kind of mode of pulling in energy. And 3 times a year, Mercury turns retrograde. It turned retrograde, which means it looks like it's going backwards from Earth's point of view. It turned retrograde on June 26th. It turns direct on July 20th. So most of this month is spent with that mental, intellectual communication function still covering old territory. And in fact, even when Mercury turns direct on July 20th, it's not until August 3rd that it gets past where it was when it turned backwards, meaning that we're still covering familiar ground.
Yeah, the common sort of understanding of Mercury retrograde is difficulty in communication, transportation, details, and technology. Mercury is associated in different ways with all of these functions. And because of that, Mercury retrograde has taken on sort of a negative tonality, and that is, oh, it's a bad time because more mistakes are likely to happen. Now, whether that's true or not, I think is going to vary according to the individual. But I think the point of Mercury retrograde, of the planet of intellect and perception going backwards, is to rethink and review. This is particularly true in Cancer, which, as Rick talked about, is a sign that is, although it's a cardinal season-starting sign which is meant to go forward, it's a little reluctant to do so.
Well, if you think about Cancer is just Latin for crab, and crabs have these big appendages, these claws that are in front of them, and when a crab really wants to move, when it really wants to get going, if it wants to aggress and go somewhere new, it turns around and runs like hell backwards, because that way the claws that don't get in the way. And so this idea of Cancer really, it does in some ways, it's like the tunnel spider that sets its trap by building its web and then just waiting at the mouth of the web, waiting for something to get caught in it. And there's that sense with Cancer, that kind of passiveness. In fact, when Mars goes into Cancer next week, we'll talk a little bit about the passive aggressiveness of that Mars in Cancer.
Yeah, and I think this notion and this idea of Cancer being passive is critical. It's critical because if we believe that, or we allow that to be the end of the story, and there's a difference between tendencies, just as we have in our personalities or as signs have, and what we choose to go forward with. Part of the purpose of studying astrology is to understand your tendencies so that you're not limited by them, so you can use them desirably and appropriately, but move away from them when you recognize they're unconscious habits that inhibit growth. And Cancer is a sign of history, of personal memory and history. So there's a lot of backward looking, just as Rick talked about that crab going back in first. There is a collective tendency in the sign of Cancer, and I think in emotions in general, for us to refer to the past as if it were the determining factor as to what's going to happen in the future. And while clearly the past, personal history, has an enormous role to play in our psychological development and our life experiences and the decisions that we make, today's a new moon in Cancer. And new moons, even in backward-looking signs, are reminders to live in the present and turn forward. This reminds me of a line I'll misquote from Tom Robbins, one of Rick's favorite writers, who Rick quoted, which is, I think, you're never too old to have a happy childhood.
It's never too late to have a happy childhood. It's the closing line in Still Life with Woodpecker.
Which means that it's never too late to gain a deeper understanding and to untangle some of the painful knots of self-limitation and suffering of your early life experiences. You don't erase the events, but the interpretation and the function that they play in our lives can change.
And Tom Robbins is a Cancer.
There you go.
Yeah, that whole idea of going forward but looking back, what you called the personal history, there's that sense of we are nurtured by our personal nostalgias. You know, it's like there are these are the good old days, a Cancerian song. You know, the good old days of summer. This is the summertime now. That sense, I thought as you were talking, there was a Marshall McLuhan who is a media guru in the 60s and early 70s who used to talk about something he called rear view mirrorism, driving ahead by looking in the rear view mirror. That's what crabs or cancers often do. But coming back to this thing of passiveness, passiveness is not to be confused with inaction, because one can appear to be not in control. I think of Ross Perot, who was a Cancer, who said, for those of you who might remember, he was the non-candidate for president who was invisible and said, I'm not really here, I'm only here because of you. Meanwhile, he was the puppet master manipulating the whole show. And I think that Cancerian energy can be very proactive in subtle ways that make it look like they're not doing anything, but in fact there can be a tremendous amount of control and passion for your own good. I'm manipulating this because I love you, and this is for you. It's the overprotective parent can be the Cancer or Cancerian mother, the image of the Jewish mother, that idea of so much protectivity that you have nowhere to move, but it's not that they're passive, it's that they're nurturing too much.
And nurturing in a controlling way. So today, with the new moon in Cancer, this is a good time to ask ourselves, what beliefs do we hold about ourselves that are rooted in the past that inhibit our goals for the future? When Rick talked about this idea of looking backwards, it's understandable. I look backwards because that's how I know who I am. If I just showed up here with a blank slate of a mind, I wouldn't know who I am. And yet, the job with all of these planets in Cancer, I think, is to revisit the past, but to revisit it as your present self, not as the wounded child, the abandoned woman, the victimized man. Whatever it is that you identify with, I think it's helpful to go back to it, to revisit it, to hang out with it, not necessarily to force yourself to try to fix it, because that's anti-Cancerian, but to allow yourself to be in a less certain place, a place of less certitude about the impact of your divorce, or that failing grade that you got, or that limp that you have that ruined your career as a track star.
Don't you think, actually I'm pretty sure you do think, that tendency to hold on to the past from Cancer is really about a need for security, for safety. And it's like, it worked for me before, it'll work for me now. Cancerian energy is said to be very loyal and tenacious because it does hold on to things that are important. There's a family values concept around the Cancerian energy. In fact, our Cancerian holiday is Independence Day, which is odd. But what do we do on Independence Day? It's in July. The sun's in Cancer. We get together with our family. We hang out by the edge of a body of water, whether it's a swimming pool or a lake or the seaside, and we eat food. We nurture. I mean, yes, we're celebrating independence, but it's kind of like there's that whole sense in Cancer of nurturing that's very, very important.
Yeah, and what nurturing does and what family does, whether it's your biological family, your soul food tribe, your collection of Pisces girlfriends, whatever it might be, take a look at what binds you to a group and ask yourself if that binding quality is, again, serving your contemporary needs. Because part of psychological growth includes the necessity of rejecting family values. Now, that doesn't mean you don't reclaim those family values, but rejecting them is a necessary step in becoming an individual who then can freely choose to pick up and continue some of the values of the family, but who does it as a matter of conscious choice rather than unconscious habit pattern.
I think that one of the ongoing issues from this particular Cancerian new moon, along with all these planets in Cancer, along with the Mercury retrograde, along with the extra planets and other water signs, in some ways, the issue is the difference between acting or between feeling, between responding based upon our gut, our intuition, our what you call the nonverbal, environmental nonverbal cues, and this larger tense environment we find ourselves in from the ongoing square between Uranus and Pluto, which is moving in and out of exactitude over a period of years, beginning back in 2011, 2012, continuing through 2015, even phasing out not until 2016. And this particular tension that's been with us as planets move through Cancer highlight that tension, but right now these planets are also highlighting this equilibrious, equilateral grand triangle involving Saturn and Neptune, and over the last weeks it involved Venus moving through that point, which has now moved on, and Mercury and the Sun and the Moon, and now we have both Jupiter and Mars coming into it. And I think that this energy of Cancer thrust against this tension of the background of deep, transformational, powerful, global, cultural, revolutionary changes is really a lot of what we're experiencing this month. The deeper changes are not stopping, but we may be stopping individually, finding comfort zones within the craziness.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a very good analysis because so much of behavior is driven by contrast. So if we are, as it appears to be, in a time of collective change with a greater degree of uncertainty than perhaps 10 years ago, it's natural to respond and react by seeking comfort. It's like if your marriage is breaking apart, you know, your ex may appear more attractive to you now because going back to things which were perhaps imperfect or not totally fulfilling in their own day, but around which you had a degree of certainty and familiarity, are often more comfortable and comforting than being in the brave new world of the unknown. So the trick is this, or a trick or an approach is this. The idea is not to choose between, do I thrust myself forward in the psychedelic transformational realities of Uranus square Pluto, or do I curl up with the familial comforts of tribe, family, nationalism, and all that? I think the issues are, how do we move between those points? How does security, familiarity serve radical change? And how does radical change keep us from getting crystallized in dull and deadening patterns?
Exactly. I think that is, and I think that issue really is the issue of both June and July. And I think that this June-July period is somewhat of a turning point in this larger scenario that's been going on for a couple of years, that perhaps began with the Fukushima earthquake, meltdown, tidal wave, Arab Spring, Occupy everything, and that's still going on, obviously. But in this, we're reaching a point now where it's almost like we're getting a little bit of perspective. We're getting a sense of I don't want to say nostalgia, but we have enough history on the opening events of this a couple years ago that we actually have a point at which we can look back and say, where are we in this process? Make a place perhaps to stand still. And I think the important thing that astrology offers us is the knowledge, is the foresight that this standing still is a temporary point. It's a center of the cyclone kind of a thing, because we still have yet to move through it. And by later on this month and on through August, when, and then on through next year, as not only Mars comes into the opposition to Pluto and square to Uranus, emphasizing that, but so does Jupiter, and it changes, on through next year, it changes the name of the game a little bit, and those things which are intense now but don't seem like in our face intense may be more in our face later on.
Yeah, I think we're dancing around things a little bit. With Mars, the action planet, still in dualistic Gemini, Mars is what really puts things into motion. So even though we've got a new moon in Cancer today, even though we have all of this watery energy, the trigger planet, Mars, is still in the dancing fool sign of Gemini, that place of jumping in and out of engagement, commitment, and that's going to change. We get the new moon today, which is a wave going forward, but I think we're going to get more engaged when Mars goes into Cancer on the 13th. But I wanted to say one more thing, at least for now, about the new moon. The new moon occurs when the sun and moon join together every month. It represents the beginning of a new cycle. The cycle of the new moon in Cancer is a new cycle of nurturance and growth, of feeling and feeding oneself. But notice they're at 16 degrees. Pluto is at 10. Uranus over here is at 12, meaning in the hours leading up to this morning's new moon, the moon triggered wild, electric, crazy, volatile Uranus and potent transformational Pluto. I almost have the feeling then this new moon's, the thing that's become the movie cliche where the two guys, usually guys, are walking out of the building that's just blown up behind them. Well, that's kind of what it's like, because this new moon in Cancer represents a new cycle, and it's just past, at least temporarily, some of these more explosive planetary elements.
Interesting. And as you were saying that, I couldn't help but thinking about the events unfolding in Egypt right now, where there's a little bit of a sense of that exploding building behind me. So I'm not saying it's over or done with, but it was somehow what you were saying conjured up those political events.
Yeah, and it also, it's very interesting, as a certain percentage of the Egyptian public want to plant their seeds in the past, in religious grounds, and yet there's a whole modern generation of Egyptians who want to plant their seeds in a future that is sort of beyond the old Islamic world of the Middle Ages.
And I think one of the things about this new moon, and then we'll leave this new moon into the past, is that Venus also in the hours coming up to the new moon was harmonizing or trying to that revolutionary, erratic, irrepressible Uranus. And so there was almost like, even though we had our roots growing and holding us to the past, at the same time we were liking the idea of what's coming around the bend, even though we don't know what it is. And that's Venus in outgoing and playful and showy Leo. And in some ways, this Venus trine Uranus is also setting a little bit of a tone for what will happen later this month and next month as the sun and the various other planets move into Leo and have a little bit more of that outgo. We leave the deep feeling and the fear of the future behind, and we go to engage it.
Yeah, I think that's well put, because there are many creative things here. This trine, an angle of 120 degrees, is considered creative. The trine is occurring between planets in Leo and Aries, fire signs, which are creative. And if Uranus, the planet of revolution and surprise, is in spontaneous Aries, which it is for 7 years, Venus in Leo says, I can play with that. I can create something with that. You mean mom is serving me the same old boring apple pie that she's been making my whole lifetime? I mean, I kind of like it, but I'm a little bored. Why don't I put some chili powder on top of it so that I can have something that's a little bit spicy and new and different, while still being connected to the traditional patterns of family and of taste.
So moving on past this new moon, we also remember we have Mercury that's retrograding, which makes it look like it's going backwards. And the sun and all these other planets, but the moon and the sun are moving this way. So if we progress this chart forward or move it forward, you can see the moon quickly passes over Mercury. But over the next couple of days, what happens is that Mercury backs up over the position where the sun is moving forward. This actually, it's technically an inferior conjunction of Mercury with the sun, meaning that Mercury is between us and the sun.
And it's the inferior planet. The sun is the superior planet.
Because Mercury can also conjunct the sun when it's on the far side, which would be a superior conjunction. But the point here is that tomorrow, actually, tomorrow, the sun lines up with Mercury, or Mercury lines up with the sun, which connects our communication, our intellect, our ideas, our thought process with the sun, which is our will, the way we radiate the energy out. But it's Mercury retrograde, so it's still hard to get it out beyond the brightness of the sun.
Yeah, this is world-class navel gazing. Cancer is a sort of inward turning sign. The sun represents the ego, the I, the letter I, and yet Mercury represents the I, the EYE. And having Mercury joined with the sun retrograde in Cancer is like looking into ourselves. Now, it depends what we do with what we see. And again, if we begin by seeing the old patterns, the old fears, the old doubts, the old neuroses, et cetera, that's fine as long as we keep moving. As long as we can discriminate or discern the difference between a perception that's passing and a reality that's permanent. And this can give us the illusion that reality is permanent, which it never is. And the point is to take what's seen and keep moving with it.
All right, now as we move this forward, remember Jupiter takes 12 years to go around one, so it moves rather slowly. Jupiter at 3 degrees of Cancer is already coming within a degree or two of being harmonized 1/3 of a circle to Saturn at 4, almost 5 degrees of Cancer, and Neptune at just barely into 5 degrees of Pisces. So I want to move this forward, but I want you to watch these two planets here and the thickness of these lines as over the next couple of days, Mars jumps that line and moves into Cancer, and Jupiter slowly moves into exact trine to make this grand harmonious water trine when Mars is lining up with Jupiter. It's a pretty stunning, and you don't have to watch any of the other planets here. Here's Mars jumping. Do you see Mars jumping over? And you see how now Jupiter, the line's thickening between Jupiter and Saturn and Jupiter and Neptune, and Mars is moving even closer and closer. Look how thick that pattern is now. These lines gain thickness as the aspects become more exact.
So Mars moves into Cancer on July 13th. And that, I think, is a very important time. While traditional astrology doesn't like Mars in Cancer because Mars is a warrior and Cancer is a homesteader. So the warrior can move into a defensive stand or a passive-aggressive stage, or we may find it more difficult to externalize the force and the passion that Mars represents.
Yeah, we can often become, I think with Mars in Cancer, we become angry or resentful because we can't express, or it's harder, it's more difficult to express that the need to either defend our territory or assert ourselves. And so I think that the danger of Mars in Cancer is burying those feelings and getting angry or getting resentful, which is not expressing the anger.
Right. And I think one of the if you've got water in your chart, a good amount, you might recognize the idea that sometimes, and I have a water moon, as does Rick, I get angry because people aren't reading my mind. Because if you care
love
for
me,
me,
you'd know.
If you love me, you'd know. you'd feel what I was feeling, and I wouldn't have to explain it to you. And that's sort of Mars in Cancer.
Incidentally, my Cancer moon is actually conjunct this new moon today. So
there you go.
Yeah, I got it all over me.
So let's read Rick's mind. All right, so we've got Mars going into
That didn't take
Cancer.
a whole lot of time. Does that mean anything?
No, it didn't. It's a short story. It's
Albert Einstein once said, if a cluttered desk is the sign of a cluttered mind, what's an empty desk the sign of?
Well, that's a mind that's open to everything. It's again.
It's a Buddhist mind.
The vast potential of emptiness. But what we have this month, and we'll jump into, because Rick and I both separately at different conferences have lectured on the grand trine that's coming up this month because it's so grand in its rarity. Now, what's happening is that on the 17th of this month, slow-moving Jupiter forms an exact grand trine, a trine harmonious 120 to Neptune and to Saturn.
On the same day that slow-moving Saturn is forming a trine to Neptune.
Well, that's actually 2 days later.
Okay, but from a standpoint of a 165-year cycle of Neptune and a 30-year cycle of Saturn, the fact that it's within a couple of days that this Jupiter is forming trines with both of them as they're forming a trine with each other is what makes this so rare. I mean, you were saying that,
right,
but you didn't say it for the people who might not get it.
Right, and it is the precision of this, the exactness of it, that represents a pure, clear signal. That we get grand trines between outer planets, but they're often a half a degree off, or they occur over a 2 or 3 week period in terms of precision. The fact that this is all precise between the 17th and the 19th is rare and special and rewarding to us. And the rewards, to be more specific, are that the pain and suffering of Saturn in Scorpio, that is having to deal with the hard, cold reality, Saturn word, for Scorpio, desire, exchange, need, hunger, resentment, that expansive, generous Jupiter in Cancer is offering wisdom and hope to our most cramped, fearful, and tight corners of our minds. And simultaneously, Jupiter is offering to Neptune, the planet of dreams and ideals, in dreamy, idealistic Pisces, it's offering a vision that's just a step down from the clouds to bring it a little bit closer to reality.
Right, and Jupiter and Neptune have a natural affinity astrologically anyhow, because Jupiter was the planet that ruled or was associated with Pisces until we discovered Neptune, and now Neptune is considered to be the modern ruler of Pisces. But those two planets are very similar in their expansive dispersiveness. But what's also interesting here, I mean, and you can see the exactness. Jupiter here is at 4 degrees 54 minutes. Neptune is at 4 degrees 58 minutes. And Saturn is at 4 degrees 54 minutes. I mean, we're talking from a cosmic perspective, this is really tight. Now, the Saturn-Neptune trine portion of this happened for the first time exactly on October 10th, past 2012. For the second time, it was mid-June, June 11th. And we might, in our own lives, go back and look at what was going on in mid-October and in June and see if we can connect any threads to those dreams, those ideals, those things we were wanting to make real, and perhaps what now we can do in order to make them real.
Yeah, and the reality largely comes through Saturn, which has to do with
planet of real,
bringing things down to Earth. And Jupiter and Saturn are the career planets. They're the socio-cultural planets that have to do with the place we take in society. The planets up to Mars are personal. They occupy this space for the most part. Jupiter and Saturn occupy this space, and the outer planets occupy some back end here, the parking lot that we can't talk about, but represents another level of consciousness.
You know, one other thing I want to mention here while we're talking about this grand trine, and we astrologers sometimes think that trines are good and squares are bad, or that trines are easier to express and squares are more difficult to express. But I just want to point out that there's this odd thing of perspective that makes good and bad things sometimes intermixed. From the Earth's point of view, from a larger perspective, an earthquake that produces a tidal wave may be really good because it prevents part of the Earth actually from blowing off completely. And the tidal wave in Indonesia, Thailand, a few years ago on Christmas occurred when Jupiter was trining Neptune, but from the other side. And so a trine between Jupiter and Neptune, in water signs even, we think it should be good. And it may be good because Saturn helps us perhaps to reach our dreams. But we need to be careful about good in what perspective. We've had some tremendous flooding already, like that the world hasn't seen in 100 years or maybe more. And we may have more flooding with this grand trine because Jupiter makes things excessive. This isn't so much from a personal point of view, but the flooding becomes an archetypal symbol for the flooding that we each experience in the amount of emotions that are coming through us, that are being downloaded at this time.
Right, which makes the role of Saturn,
Even
the
more
dike,
important.
especially important.
Yeah, I agree.
Because what Saturn is boundaries and limits. And in terms of the model that Rick gave about the potential to be flooded by our own feelings, what Saturn represents, among other things, is the one who poses the question, but what can you do to make it real? If you're going off the deep end with fear, Saturn in Scorpio says, okay, fear is part of life. What equipment do you need? What behavior, what tools will make you best able to deal with whatever it is you're fearful that's coming? And in a positive, proactive, and forward-leaning way, what does it take if you're flooded by an ideal or a dream that seems too far out of reach? Saturn says, put a container around it, a container of time, a container of commitment, and build a process of moving towards those ideals and dreams. Because there was somebody who had a dream about a product or a service that wasn't well bound and contained, and they didn't make it. And somebody else came along with the very same concept and contained it and brought it to market and made it real. I don't think that we have to make it real this month.
I agree with you.
But it's interesting that maybe part of the lesson of this month, or not the lesson, but another thing we can learn here is we can live in a world that's positive, Jupiter trine Neptune, and a world that's scary, Saturn in Scorpio, and begin, without overreacting, to see how those pieces might fit inside of us. Where do your fears live as compared to your aspirations? Where do your doubts hang out as compared to your faith? This does offer the potential for some kind of, I was going to say dialogue, but really it's a conversation, a trialogue between all of these pieces of ourselves.
So on the 17th, we have Jupiter forming the exact trines with Saturn and Neptune. And then by the 19th, we have Saturn forming the exact trine with Neptune. And then we also have Mars now sneaking in. Mars is moving faster than Jupiter. It's catching up to Jupiter. It's within a degree of being exactly lined up with Jupiter. And by the 20th, Mars moves into the picture, and Mars makes exact trines with both Saturn and with Neptune, adding another boost of energy or fire, even though it's in water. It adds adrenaline to the mix.
Yeah, absolutely. I brought up the idea that Jupiter and Saturn had to do with the role in the culture, which from my perspective is here. And Neptune, Uranus, and Pluto have to do with the back end of the parking lot or another planet. But Mars is here. Mars is personal, and Mars moving into the picture suggests the capacity to activate. Now, that sounds pretty good, to be able to activate the expansive, realistic dream. But Mars, Jupiter can also be the religious warrior, or philosophical or righteous anger. So that would be the one thing I'd be a little bit cautious about, that even if your anger to you is totally righteous because the cause is right, the question isn't the morality of your anger. The question is the efficacy of your anger. Because Mars and Jupiter can really blow it up big time, but if you're going to get anything done, you're going to have to sit down and talk to the bad guy, Saturn and Scorpio.
I think you're right, Jeff. I think this is really interesting because when Mars and Jupiter meet up, and they do so every other year, when Mars and Jupiter meet up for a few days, there's this sense of over-enthusiasm because there's this sense of ego is no longer standing between the great idea I have and making it happen. Now, with that trine to Neptune, I think it certainly can take on idealistic or religious, more religious overtones. However, I also think that the trine to Saturn can enable me to justify anything that I can dream up as good. Now, that's not necessarily a good side of it, but I think that we might see again on the international, scene, on the news scene, some events here that may be events based upon someone being able to justify their action because it's for a good cause.
And I think you're also tapping into the Saturn and Scorpio.
Yes.
It's not that I'm so good, it's that you're so much worse. So it's really important. I'm just 20% evil, but you're 45%, so I'm justified in killing you. And that is a projection. That's an unwillingness to include our own shadow, the undigested aspect of our own dark psyche, into the process.
Now, the other thing that you'll notice as this grand trine has become more and more exact, Mercury has retrograded, backed up to almost being reactivating. It doesn't quite it's at 13 degrees going backwards. It doesn't get to the 12 degrees, the exact square to Uranus, or the 9 degrees, the exact opposition to Pluto, but it's exact enough that that square is buzzing again. But on that same day, on July 20th, Mercury, which has backed up, retrograded as far as it's going to go, turns around or holds still, and it begins to move forward over the next few days. And so, again, we have this great counterpoint, this kind of like standing in the ocean, the tide's coming in, but the undertow is pulling us out because Mercury, even though it's in backward moving Cancer and moving backwards, and even though there's all this watery energy, Mercury now makes its counterpoint and begins its forward movement for the next 3 months, 4 months.
Yeah, and Mars hits Jupiter exactly 2 days later as Mercury's picking up speed on the 22nd. On the 22nd, the sun goes into Leo, which is bold, and it's also the day of the full moon. So there is a quickening.
It's also the day that Venus goes into Virgo. Three planets change sign.
I thought we weren't going to tell the people about that this year. We're going to skip that this year. But what that means to me is the pace really picks up. That it's almost as if the grand trine could be this big in-breath, where we're not so much trying to accomplish some things, but opening ourselves to see the blueprint or the outline. And then, as Mars joins the party, on the 20th, as Mercury goes direct, and then on the 22nd, with so much activity then, I think we begin to gallop.
Yeah, and I think that the sun's movement into Leo and Venus's movement out of Leo, it almost keeps the Leo fire burning. They happen on the same day. Venus in Leo was the idea of this leonine energy sounding good, looking good. There's this attraction to to bringing it all out in the open and not just seething with it or feeling it on the inside. And so as Venus moves into Virgo, to kind of take these ideas and make them more useful, to in some ways bring them down to earth. Virgo is an earth sign. The sun comes blamming, powering into Leo, and it almost becomes, it's like the magician doing the trick where the magic is happening over here, but he's doing this and everybody's eyes are over here, and that's the sun moving into Leo right now, because there's still all this stuff going on here with this grand trine and with Jupiter, with Mars lined up with Jupiter, but all of a sudden it's looking like we need to be looking out there.
Yeah, so there's an interesting switching going on between Venus, which is love, relationship, personal values, attraction, grace, charm, and the sun, which is core, will, and purpose. So now we have Venus in Leo, where she's hot, 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 but the sun is in Cancer, where she's cooking dinner and taking care of the babies. So we've got that sort of mixed message. And then Venus goes into Virgo, which means she's putting on her cleaning lady outfit and preparing to operate socially in a more service-oriented, modest, and careful way. But behind the scenes, she's got her gown and her robes and is ready to rule.
Yeah, ready to party, too.
Well, that too.
Yeah, rule. I mean, Leo is a noble sign. Leo is the sign related to gold. Leo is like the Sun King. The sun is the center of our little corner of the galaxy, and when the sun goes into Leo, the sun shines, and we see where things are, and we see who's boss. We see who's in the center.
But that sun in Leo, which normally would like to do a one-person show, sun steps into Leo, and moments later, oh crap.
Literally moments later.
Moments later, the moon in Aquarius opposes it. It's the full moon. Hey, I'm elected king. Well, guess what? We now have a democracy. You're out of business. I hope you enjoyed your 14 minutes.
Aquarius being the sign of the general populace, if Leo is the sign of the king.
Right, so that Aquarius full moon is always the contrast between collective and egalitarian values, right, Aquarius, and the dominant will of the individual as represented by the monarch in Leo. But in any case, this usually quite sociable full moon is dampened by the fact that Saturn in Scorpio is making right angles. So the argument is, you know, the sun in Leo says, I want a big coronation, and I want a big carriage and gold clothes. You got to impress the people. That's what's really important. And the moon in Aquarius says, no, it's a people's party. Let's not get one fancy thing. Let's have something fabulous for everybody. And then Saturn in Scorpio, the treasurer, comes in and says, guess what? We can't afford any of this stuff. You know, the celebration needs to be a bit more modest.
Or it's over.
Oh, that's right. Or it's over. So it's something that's about delayed gratification. Saturn is delayed. Leo and Aquarius are a party pair. But with Saturn square the full moon, it's about, look, I could have this blowout event or this blowout purchase now. But maybe if I don't get this big thing, I can save to something else that will be even more valuable in the long run. Saturn, the planet of hard, cold reality, says party isn't enough. What are you going to have when the party's over?
Well, and I think that this then becomes the full moon becomes another turning point in the month, because it changes the theme of what's going on. And from that moment on until the end of the month, we have two issues that are cooking. Neither one of them are easy. One of them, and we'll watch this unfold graphically in a moment, one of them is that between the 22nd and the 27th, the sun moves into exact square with Saturn, re-emphasizing what you just talked about in reference to the full moon square to Saturn. It's almost followed up by the sun square to Saturn.
It's got a 5-day run.
It's got a 5-day run where things just get tighter and responsibilities kind of crunch in, and whether it's the lack of money to pay for the party or whatever it is, things have consequences and we have to deal with them. That's one thing. I'll let you come back in a second, Jeff, and hit them both back up. The other thing is that as the month progresses, not only does this square line get thicker, while these trine lines begin to get thinner. But the other thing is that as we get closer to the end of the month, Mars comes into, by the end of the month, an exact opposition to Pluto, and by the beginning of August, an exact square to Uranus, re-highlighting the fact that this trine was a temporary, as I said last month, pause in the disaster. And I don't really mean disaster, I mean it in the sense of disaster, meaning a bad star. And the bad star, or the more difficult condition, is this Uranus square Pluto. And as Mars moves into that, and we'll just unfold this here, and you can see that those lines beginning to change. And here we have the exact square between the Sun and Saturn. There it is right there, between the Sun and Saturn. And here we have Mars moving into the opposition to Pluto, which is exact by the 31st, by the last day of the month.
The square to Uranus is exact.
No, oh yeah, that's right. The opposition to Pluto is exact on the 27th. Thank you. And then the square to Uranus is exact by the end of the month. So we get them both, the opposition and the square, before the month is out. And that's a very, it's like the old saying, like march in like a lamb and out like a lion, or in like a lion and out like a lamb. I never remember which it is. But this is that, only
reverse.
I mean, the month comes in like a lamb and goes out like a lion.
Right. A couple of things. I want to say something
Leo
nice.
the lion.
Yes. I want to say something nice about Venus in Virgo. While this discussion of the full moon about how much to spend on the party, how much to love, how much to give, it's Venus in Virgo. It says, it's okay. We can make our own party favors. Venus in Virgo is very crafty. Venus in Virgo
efficient
and Venus is coming up to oppose Neptune a few days after that, and it's the opportunity to do things that are more modest and careful, but provide the sense of joy and inspiration that both Venus and Neptune offer. And
the Venus opposition to Neptune is on like about the
26th. Yeah,
early on the 26th.
And the other thing I wanted to say is this Mars transit, or the Mars transits, the opposition of Pluto and square to Uranus that Rick brought up, are extremely important. Remember, Mars is the trigger. If in a good way it triggers the grand trine with faith, imagination, and tuning in, Mars triggering the Pluto-Uranus square can be volatile, dangerous, explosive, impulsive, and I think one of the keys to which way Mars falls depends upon whether your Mars in Cancer feels like a wimp, a disempowered wimp.
Where it can do crazier things.
Right, who can only act with impotent, destructive rage. These mass murderers and crazy people who do shit, you think they feel potent? Of course they don't. They feel impotent, which is why they've got to externalize their impotence in their destructive behavior. Right. So the angrier, the edgier you find yourself getting, if you do at the end of the month, take a breath, back up, find something that nourishes your sense of authority, power, and competence so that you can provoke change in a way that integrates Mars in Cancer, which is, I may change your life, turn it upside down, but I'm going to do it in a caring way and make sure that you're protected throughout the process.
Well said. Well said. It's quite a month.
Yeah.
And, and I think that one of the things that underlies the whole month, again, is this juxtaposition of the stress and tension and need for dynamic change, the inequality of things that becomes more and more apparent, that we have to do something about it, and that juxtaposed with the part of us that can hold the position of calmness, of go to a place where we can stand in the center of all of this change and watch it unfold. And know that we don't have to just make everything happen in this moment, that it's going to take time to unfold. Remember, the Uranus-Pluto square is not going to be over for another 2 to 3 years. There are changes that happen in an afternoon, and there are changes that take decades to unfold. This is one somewhere in between that'll take a good handful of years. And so we don't need to feel like if we didn't make it all happen today or this month, we need to get crazy by the end of the month to make it happen, because that will be the wrong path.
Great. Well put. All right. So,
And thank you all.
yeah, that's our report for the month. We encourage you to patronize Soul Food so that we can all continue to be here to enjoy the grace of this very special place. If you'd like us to look at your chart, first name, time, date, and place of birth on a little piece of paper up here, and we'll see you back here in about 15 minutes.
And I just want to reemphasize what Jeff just said. Jeff and I come here each month because this is our community. You are in this community, and the way that we get to vote is economically. So if you've been thinking about a birthday gift or very early Christmas shopping or whatever it is, you know, rather than patronizing, you know, the big brand store down the block, spend some money here, because that's what keeps this going, and that's what keeps us able to come back month in and month out. This is a great place, and also a thanks to the barista boys, Aaron and Craig with his new short hair, and a congratulations to Kevin and Makia, the new owners, or the new stakeholders, if you will, of Soul Food. We're in for a new run. Thank you all.
When our work here is done, and the life crown is won, and our troubles and trials are o'er, all our sorrows will end, and our